My mother-in-law runs into me with her car and pretends it was an accident. Sorry, I didn't see you there. Lol. Me. Oh no, call an ambulance now. She ran into... Hey, be careful! I now found myself right in the middle of the trajectory of a car gone AWOL. My mother-in-law's car jumped over the parking lot threshold and plowed towards me in the backyard at an alarmingly high speed. I heard a soul-crushing thud of an impact, and my mother-in-law peeked out of the driver's seat of the now halted car. I'm sorry, dear. I didn't see you. My mother-in-law, who was smiling up until she locked eyes with me, immediately turned pale as she saw me next to the car, completely unharmed. Nope. It wasn't me that was run over, but it was. This is the story of how my husband and my mother-in-law tried using abuse and force to get me to bend to their will for their own personal benefit in the family business, ultimately resorting to perhaps the most chilling of all, and how subsequent investigations on my part, as well as the police, revealed something shocking, something that would plunge them both into the deepest depths of misery. My name is Bethany, and I'm a 28-year-old accountant who now runs a human resources agency with direct ties to my old father-in-law's business. My husband, Zachariah, better known as Zach, is 2 years older than me, and we met at our old job in the accounting department of a house vacuum cleaner company. He helped so much as my professional mentor, teaching me the ins and the outs of the work, and even offered a few pointers on how to put myself on the road to success. We often had lunch together during breaks, and as we talked more about our private lives, I came to think of him as a kind-hearted, hard-working guy who never failed to see the beauty in everything in life. The way he interpreted even difficult situations in a positive manner was especially admirable. I was what one could call a stubborn quitter, wherein I would do what I could about a difficult situation, and as fret over it for a while. My motivation to solve the problem eventually dropped so low, I just gave up on finding a solution. A good example is that one time I just couldn't get my scores high enough to get into my first choice university. That was a dark point in my life. Anyway, we hit it off, and after I confessed I had feelings for him, we became a couple. We got married after 19 months, and our married life was very nice. Our workplace used to be rather small. It was merely a branch office of the house appliance company, which was coincidentally owned by my husband's family, particularly his father, Sorensen Defoe. After we got married, Mr. Defoe arranged for his son to move back home. Zach was always planning to move back home to help out at the company headquarters, and he'd made a deal with Sorensen. He adamantly insisted I call him by his first name, that he would come back once he got married. His wife was also to be transferred to headquarters as well. At first, we had planned to rent an apartment near my parents' house, but Zach told me that he was having difficulty finding a place to live. It's hard to find a good place to rent in that area. That area doesn't really have any apartment buildings. They have a lot of houses instead. But if we don't decide soon, we'll be late for our new job starting next month, Zach. You know what? Let's just move into my parents' house instead of going through the hassle of looking for a place to rent. Dad says that option's fine too. I felt like my husband was trying to talk me out of finding an apartment pretty insistently, and I was honestly not too happy about it. But I had already resigned from my old job and was about to start working at Sorensen's company, so I had no choice but to agree to move in with my in-laws. I had visited the Defoe residence several times, and it was a large one-story building with a large garden. Only Sorensen and his wife Carla lived there, and there were many rooms, so there seemed to be no problem for us to move in to live with them. When I visited the house again to greet the Defoes, Carla came outside to greet us. Thank you for offering us a place to stay, Mrs. Defoe. I hope we'll have a nice life together. I'm so glad you decided to live here, Zach, my darling. It's your house after all. You just make yourself at home, okay? Carla outright ignored my greetings and kept on talking to my husband, and that alone made me feel a little uneasy about the future. A few days later, after a rather hectic moving operation, we started work at our new place of employment. Sorensen's company was short of accounting clerks, so I was an immediate asset. Zach's specialty was in sales, and he often went out on business to forge contracts with shipping companies and new factories that were developing on the outskirts of town. Sorensen told me, "We've been working under the old system, the same old system, you see. It's been of great help to us, but that was in the olden days. Times are changing, and the business must change with them. I'm thinking of doing something to improve it. I'm looking forward to working with you, my dear. Of course, sir, I'll do my absolute best. No, Bethany. What do you call me? Sorry. Of course, Sorensen, I'll do my absolute best, lol. Now there's the future mother to my future grandchildren. Lol. I had gained the trust of Sorensen, the president of the company, and began to take on most of the accounting duties. Within the first 3 days of working, I'd already found quite a few irregularities in the company's accounts, and while I did find the old system rather interesting, Sorensen did think right when it came to how outdated it seemed. The numbers weren't promising, and I set myself to do what I could to improve them. While I remained loyal to Sorensen and his business, his son, my husband Zach, on the other hand, became noticeably more selfish in his working attitude, probably because he had started working at the headquarters of his father's company. He came to work later than I did in the mornings, often a full 2 hours later, and he started taking more and more days off. Hey Zach, haven't you been leaving early, coming in late, and taking days off a lot lately? This will be treated as absenteeism, and it will affect your salary, you know. That's something you should fix. You mean to say you want me to cut you some slack? That's cheating. I would never do that to your father. Oh my God, you're such a useless wife. Look, I'm going to take over from Dad in some time. I'm going to be the president of this company. Can't you see I'm not like any one of these other regular employees here? I'm going to be a part of the intellectual and financial elite. I ought to be treated as such, Bethany. Au contraire, Monsieur Zachariah. If you're going to be the boss, you ought to at least set an example for your subordinates. And yet you take too many holidays. People will not be loyal to any president who couldn't care less about the business and spent all his time gallivanting in Hawaii or Guam. You shut the frick up. My hobby is traveling, in case you didn't know. If I don't take holidays, I can't go away anywhere. In this way, my husband took advantage of his father's business environment and became absorbed in his hobby of traveling by coming in late or leaving early. His hobbies cost a lot of money, and I was worried about his wasting money. Thus, we began to argue more often, and our marriage began to show cracks in the cement. My problems were not limited to Zach's working attitude, but I also had a serious problem with Carla, my mother-in-law at home. Every time I had another quarrel with her son, she would always come to me and go on a raging session of complaining. Bethany, you don't correct darling Zach's working hours or holidays now, do you? That angel is going to be the president in the future. Isn't it the role of a wife to support her husband? Being dishonest to Mr. Defoe's company is not supporting my husband, Mrs. Defoe. Oh my, you talk so big for such a small girl. You really are beyond useless, Bethany. I ought to go back to working for the company and support Zach myself. I winced, mostly because I knew better. As a matter of fact, Carla Defoe used to work as the head accountant at her husband's company, but she was forced to resign voluntarily because of her poor administrative skills and the fact that she was taking advantage of her position as the wife of the president of the company to take advantage of the so-called sweethearts treatment from business partners. Carla, who could no longer withdraw as much money as she wanted from the company's funds, was under a lot of stress, and since I was her daughter-in-law who had joined the company to replace her, she was sarcastic and harsh to me from the very beginning. Sorensen, who is the president of the company, relies on me because I have the difficult job of cleaning up all that remained of his wife's misconduct during her working days, which was actually one of the core reasons the business's numbers took an unfortunate downturn in recent years, while also performing my other regular duties as a company accountant. Most of the time, Mrs. Defoe would try to bully me out of her husband's eyes and ears. She was home alone while we were at work, and eventually I came to suspect her of something. She would sometimes take my personal belongings without my permission. To make matters worse, when I questioned her about it, she would get upset, saying, "Mrs. Defoe, my necklace is missing from its case. Could it be possible that you borrowed it?" "Ah, yes, I meant to tell you. A friend of mine wanted to use it for an outing, so I lent it to her. Didn't I tell you so beforehand?" No ma'am, you didn't." "Well, what's your friend's contact information? I'll check with her." "Hey, I lent it to her as a courtesy. Are you trying to embarrass me in front of my friend?" "I don't mean to. I'm just trying to keep track of my belongings as you do, I'm sure, Mrs. Defoe." That's where the duty of a wife comes in, Bethany. You're supposed to shut up and lend it to whoever would like to borrow it. Can't you even understand that? You really are beyond useless, aren't you? In the end, she didn't seem to be cooperative in returning the necklace, so I had no choice but to take my own measures to defend myself. I signed up for a privately owned small safe deposit box at a nearby bank, and in that box, I kept my branded items, my jewelry, assorted certificates, bank books, and personal seals. With all my valuables missing from my room, Carla grew increasingly frustrated, and next began to demand liquid cash rather explicitly. Bethany, darling, I have a little payment to make at a store. Could you please give me $500? $500? What kind of payment are you going to make with such an outrageous amount? I have various social engagements. You see, in case you forgot, I'm the wife of the president. If you tell me the store that needs the payment, I'll go pay it for you. It's more secure that way. What nonsense! How far are you willing to go to humiliate me? What would the point be if I don't pay for what I buy myself? I won't be able to go to the store next time. What would the point be if I don't pay for what I buy myself? She just contradicted herself with that statement right there. She was demanding me my money after all. But that aside, I began to question Carla's attitude. Not only did she refuse to accept my offer to pay on her behalf, but she mentioned she would go to the same store again sometime. What kind of store was this? Mrs. Defoe's face turned red as she became furious at my all too justifiable curiosity. That's enough, you worthless piece of shit. And with that, she walked away. I was so worried about my mother-in-law's extravagant spending that I decided to talk to someone about it. I didn't feel comfortable telling Sorensen right away, so I decided to ask my husband, Zach, who was his son, for advice first. Hey Zach, is your mother in financial trouble? I'm worried because she's making a lot of demands of me. My mother is demanding? Then why don't you just make sure she meets her demands, What I'm trying to say is that I'm worried about what your mother spends her money on. What your mother spends her money on is none of your business. It's not a wife's place to tell her mother-in-law or anyone else for that matter what to do. All right, I see where this is going. The next time she asks me for money, I'm talking to your father. As soon as I brought up the idea of consulting Sorensen, Zach turned pale. Wait, don't tell Dad for the love of Mom. I'll talk to her. Get some sense into her. Just don't tell Dad anything. I smirked. So Sorensen was the chink in their armor of abuse and misery, I see. And I had a feeling that Zach was not going to do anything about his mother's needless extravagance. Plus, I was worried about what bullshit would happen next. One day, Zach and Mrs. Defoe asked me to bring them the company's bookkeeping records. Bookkeeping records? I can't do that. For what reason would you ask me to do such a thing? Well, we just want to check something about some vouchers from when I was working for the company. Even so, I'm sorry, but you'll have to file a proper application to the company to be given official authorization. You don't know what the frick you're talking about. This company is owned by Mom and Dad. Respectfully disagree, but go on. So it's only natural that you, as my wife, and as the head accountant of the company, have to be willing to oblige when Mom asks you for something. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you're in the sales department, right, Zach? I would like to know named you head accountant all of a sudden. It specifically states in the company contract that any demands for classified business documents, bookkeeping records, etc., may be provided under the only condition that official authorization by the president or of an individual in a surrogate position is granted. Read. Chapter 4, subsection 4, titled Official Documents, for specifics. And additionally, Mrs. Defoe is already retired, therefore she has nothing to do with the company itself, except for her familial ties to it. She really is a fricking useless piece of horseshit. Why did you have to marry this woman, Zach? Hey, Mom is scolding me because of you. What are you going to do about it? I was repulsed by the fact that not only did these two not at least try to understand what I was saying, but they also thought of the company as if it was their personal property. And in fact, I had been reconfirming the books because I saw that some figures just didn't quite add up. In other words, I suspected that company funds had recently been misappropriated, but it was just a theory at that point. I was adamant in my refusal to comply with the demands of Zach and his mother, But little did I know how fed up they were with my obstinacy, and they were about to hatch a very chilling plan. The next day was my day off, and I was tending to my garden as Mrs. Defoe had instructed me to do. I was trimming the branches of a shrub in the hedges when I accidentally cut my finger on the tip of a particularly sharp branch. I stopped working in the garden and went inside to put a bandage on my finger when Zach came in and said, "Hey, I thought you were in the garden. What about the garden work Mom wanted you to do? You know how very particular she is about that hedge, eh?" "I'm just taking a break." "I see. Come on, get in the yard. Mom will be home any second." "I'm not going to do it today. I just hurt my finger and I'm not going to do it anymore. She can wait another day." I saw his face turn bitter, but then he smiled and said to me, "Well, I'll help you. Let's get this over with. Can't have Mom get upset again, what with things going on lately." Why did that sound like a convoluted attack towards me? Was I the cause of Mrs. Defoe's apparently bad mood? No, I'm just refusing to adhere to her ridiculous line of logic. Meanwhile, Zach was already heading towards the front door as he said so. Getting him to help with, well, anything was a rare thing, so I agreed to get the job done if he offered to help me. I asked him to pick up the fallen branches as I kept on clipping, but he seemed to be distracted. He looked at the time on his watch, towards the road, or his surroundings. He did not seem to be keeping to his offer of helping me on the work. Then I heard the sound of a car engine. I turned around to see my Mrs. Defoe's car slowly backing into our driveway to park it. I didn't pay any more attention, because the distance between the parking space and the hedge was roughly 10 meters, which wasn't dangerous. I just kept working. Zach, who was bending down to pick up a few branches I'd clipped at my feet, exclaimed, "Whoa!" He seemed to have gotten his hair and sweater entangled in the lower branches that I hadn't cut yet, and he was stuck. "Oh dear, let me help you." Zach started to panic for some reason, and I tried to warn him not to move because he would get tangled up in the branches even more, and I went around the other side to get his sweater untangled. But that's when I noticed something strange. The sound of the car's engine was revving, and the car seemed to be accelerating and getting closer. I now found myself right in the middle of the trajectory of Mrs. Defoe's car gone AWOL. It jumped over the parking lot threshold and plowed towards me in the backyard at an alarmingly high speed. "Hey! Be careful! Oh, Zach! Look out! Stop! Stop!" I shouted and waved my hands in the air, but the sound of the accelerating engine drowned out my voice. The car was getting closer and closer. I quickly whirled out from between the car and the hedge and barely avoided a collision, but my husband, who was crouched down, was not so lucky. With a dull thud, the car crashed through the hedge, sending him flying through the air, through the hedge onto the patch of grass behind it. My screams echoed throughout the yard, and Mrs. Defoe's head came out of the driver's side window of the car. "I'm sorry, dear, I didn't see you." When she peeked out of the window, she was smiling up until she locked eyes with me, and that's when she immediately turned pale as she saw me next to the car, completely unharmed. I suspected that she had tried to hit me with the car on purpose. "Why are you safe and sound? I was sure I felt a bump on the backside of the car. It wasn't me who you hit, you maniac." I rushed to take a look at my husband, who was the victim here, and saw that his legs were sticking out of the hedge. I went around the hedge, and when I approached him, perhaps he was unconscious, because he didn't move a muscle. Zach, are you okay? Answer me, Zach." When I called out to him, his eyelids moved slightly, but he did not open his eyes. I shouted out to Mrs. Defoe, whose face I could see was peeking out of the car window, in utter shock of what had just happened. "Oh my God! Call an ambulance, Mrs. Defoe." "Who did I hit? Oh my God, no way!" "It was Zach that you hit, Mrs. Defoe. He's unconscious." "No way! Zachariah! Darling, answer me, please! What the hell is going on, Bethany? What on earth did you do to my Zachariah?" Mrs. Defoe was so upset that she got out of the car, literally sprinted in her high heels around the hedge to my husband, who was lying on the ground, and started to blame me for the accident. I answered her questions surprisingly calmly. "I didn't do anything, Mrs. Defoe. You just backed up way too much the car and hit him yourself." "That's absurd. Why did the car hit my darling Zach and not you? This is ridiculous." When I actually heard her start to speak her mind, The doubt I had felt earlier became a certainty. Wait, wait, wait. Did you intend to hit me with the car, Mrs. Defoe? She had a shocked expression, covered her mouth with her hands, and her eyes started to swim. What are you talking about, Bethany? Did I try to hit you? No, of course not. I admit I'm not a bad driver, and my parking is especially pathetic. I swear I never tried to hit anyone. At that moment, Zach let out a faint moan. Zach, pull yourself together. Do you see me? It's me, darling, your mother. Everything's going to be all right. Ouch! Why me? Why was I called an ambulance and Zach was rushed to the hospital. But in the ambulance, perhaps he was in a daze and wasn't in control of what he was saying, but I was certain I heard him say to me, We were going to hurt Bethany. Why was I hit? Why? Hearing this, Mrs. Defoe said in sure panic, Oh, darling, you've hit your head too. You're talking nonsense. Gradually, I began to see the truth. Zach must have been planning to team up with his mother to hit me with the family car. The reason for this was that there were things in the company's books that would be inconvenient for me to go through, and potentially discover something that would expose them after all. I knew I could not forgive them for wanting to harm, or potentially kill me for their own selfish reasons. Zach had to stay in the hospital for a while because he had broken his leg and suffered a moderate concussion. I explained the situation to Sorensen, who had rushed to the hospital once he heard the news of his son having an accident. He was incredulous at first, but then I showed the evidence of his son's embezzlement of company assets and of his wife's debts from host clubs. Over the course of the next few days, when police interrogated them about what had happened, along with testimonies from myself, they confessed that they had intentionally tried to injure me. I then hired a lawyer and obtained an order of divorce against Zach. I decided to file a police report under the charge of intentional attempt of injury, and I threatened to get police involved, but they begged me to settle the matter privately. Under the condition that they both pay me individual sums of compensation, I agreed to let the incident pass under the radar of the public eye. Zach was subsequently fired from his father's company by Sorensen himself, who was now convinced that he had embezzled money from the business. He was kicked out of his home too, and nowadays I hear he's working part-time day and night to repay his debts. As for the old Mrs. Defoe, Sorensen divorced her and went back to her parents' home to work for her brother and his family on their farm. She's now doing physical labor out in the fields for no pay. I wanted to continue working for Sorensen's business, but it was honestly difficult for me to continue living in Zach's hometown, so I discussed the matter with Sorensen and decided to set up a human resourcing agency in my own hometown, the city from which Zach and I had come before we moved into his parents' home. It was good to be home, and fortunately, I was able to get some support from Sorensen himself, as his way of apologizing for not noticing his family's intentions sooner, and for making me endure some hard times for a while. He didn't have to do such a thing, but being the kind soul that he is, how could I refuse? The agency is doing well, by the way. Having learned the horror of what money and greed can do to even the kindest people, I will do what I can to run a solid business and live my life while valuing a trusting relationship with everyone I meet around me.